Hello, my name is Lou Cox and I'm a lecturer in costume construction and fashion design. I primarily teach pattern cutting and sewing, and I've been teaching for just over 20 years. I currently run the BA Honours Costume Construction degree at University Centre South Essex. I'm also a student. I'm studying my master's degree at the University of Westminster in London, where I'm currently studying an MRes in creative practice. And in this slide, in the picture you can see on this slide, is one of my data sculptures that uses creative pattern cutting techniques. So what is creative pattern cutting? Creative pattern cutting is a style of pattern cutting that is experimental and conceptual. It breaks the rules of traditional pattern cutting and allows for the exploration of often geometric and voluminous forms that somehow change the body plane in an unusual way. Creative pattern cutting's origins come from Japan, with designers such as Rei Kawakubo and Yohji Yamamoto, and their trailblazing has led to creative pattern cutting techniques being taught in universities and colleges across the world. On this slide you can see a range of different images here. All of these people are current creative pattern cutters, master cutters. So you can see the Pattern Magic book here by Tomoko Nakamichi. She has written a whole range of different books that are really amazing. We've also got Creative with Shapes by Usha Doshi. Very simple, very effective pattern cutting techniques that just create beautiful sculptural forms. Other master cutters include Shingo Sato, who has developed a technique called transformational reconstruction. And the center image you can see on the slide here is actually some of my students' work. We had master cutter Julian Roberts come and visit us and teach us his subtraction pattern cutting techniques. I'm studying my MRes in creative practice part-time and have just started my second and final year, and the work I'm showing you today is very much work in progress. I still don't entirely know where this project will lead, and anything could change depending on where my research takes me. However, I am excited to share my work with you, as it will hopefully inform the development of any future work I do, but will also enable me to be more informed about data visualization. My initial idea for my MRes was to use creative pattern cutting, but not in a costume or a fashion sense. So in other words, I will not be making clothing or costumes. Instead, I want to take pattern cutting out of its usual context and create sculptural forms to challenge my pattern cutting abilities and to broaden my creative horizons. An early idea I had was to create 3D forms that were representational of sound, and this led me to look at the iconic Joy Division Unknown Pleasures album cover. I thought the image on the album cover represented a sound wave. However, it is in fact inspired by a PhD written by Harold D. Kraft Jr. He wrote it in the 1970s as part of his PhD. And the stacked plot you can see on the right hand side was actually the data that he collected from a rotating neuron star. And it's not radio waves, it's not sound waves, it's actually radio waves. And this was a light bulb moment for me, and it led me to research into work of data visualization and the community of data visualization that obviously we're the whole reason why we're doing this presentation today. I decided to use the stacked plot for the neuron star as a starting point for my first actual practical experimentation. So I took the first 9 lines from the stacked plot and drafted out a pattern. I upscaled the size, obviously, because it would be too small to work with as it currently was. And I used calico, which is the cream fabric you can see here, which is a rough cotton, which we generally use to make samples with. And I created a jabberer, which is a pattern cutting technique by Tomoko Nakamichi, but I obviously utilised the lines from the data stacked plot, and I was really happy with the outcome. I felt that it was interesting and it had real potential, but I did obviously realise that I would need to find further data sources to inform my work. My MRes started in September 2019, not long after the first COVID-19 lockdown period. When the pandemic broke, each day as we sat down to watch the evening news, data charts were everywhere, communicating infection rates, death rates, etc. As the number of deaths rose each day, it was becoming increasingly scary. The images we saw on the screen were harrowing. In the UK especially, we were focused on the work by NHS staff and key workers, and seeing their dedication and their tenacity was inspiring, and it was hard not to be moved by the stories being broadcast each day. However, despite these moving stories, there were still people breaking the rules and putting themselves and others at risk. And it was then that I decided to use COVID-19 data as my main focus. Part of my teacher training covered different learning styles, and generally we are taught that students fall into different groups, learning style groups. So it could be a visual learner, a kinesthetic learner, auditory or linguistic learner. There are more than 4 groups, but the 4 that I've mentioned are widely thought to be the main groups. And in the 20 years that I've been teaching, I found that students' learning styles differ greatly. They are very nuanced and very specific to the individual, regardless of if they are neurodiverse or neurotypical. And it is my job as the lecturer to learn my students' learning language. And looking on the UK government website at COVID-19 death rate data for the first and the second lockdowns, I noticed that the data was presented in an Excel spreadsheet. Now, I'm a practical learner, and whilst I understand the numbers, I know what they mean, I understand the differences between the numbers, it wasn't resonating with me in quite the same way due to my learning style being not particularly numerically focused. The data that you can see on these spreadsheets here were from lockdown 1 and lockdown 2. So the bottom set of figures is for lockdown 1 in the UK, and it's actually just for England, the various different areas with England and Wales. And the top set of figures is for the second lockdown, again for England and Wales. And each of these numbers are representational of death rates by week during the lockdown by region. So I translated this numerical data into a line graph, just using the Excel format to do that. And this is a format that, again, makes more sense to me than looking at a spreadsheet. I then decided to basically copy each of these lines and to create patterns. And you can see me drafting the patterns here. Again, I upscaled the patterns, and I took my time really carefully copying each one of the lines from the line graph there. I then made another jabberer using the Tomoko Nakamichi technique, and again I was really happy with the outcome. Each segment of the sample is representational of the death rate data for the particular region that is representing, and you can see my handwritten notes on the inside there that labelling each section. I think the forms are quite engaging, and they make me want to ask questions. They make me want to find out more, like what's it about and what does it represent. And the feedback I was getting from my peers and colleagues was positive. And at this point, I decided I needed to really get some wider research. So I did a survey, and over 74% of people felt that for them as an individual, seeing data represented in a 3D format would be something that they would like to see. And this was for a whole variety of different reasons. For some people, it was about being in an immersive environment where they could actually walk in and be part of the data. So if I made these sculptures really large and created almost like data landscapes, that would be something that they would be interested in seeing. For other people, it's to do with their learning style. They're very kinesthetic or very tactile learners. And for some people, it's actually because they were visually impaired and they could actually feel and touch the ridges of each of the sculptures, and that would help them to further understand what was being communicated in terms of the figures. This feedback was great, and it really sort of helped me to really get into my research. It felt like it was very purposeful, and I experimented with a whole range of different techniques, projection, using different pattern cutting techniques, face masks, all sorts of different things. And I was really playing around with different sense of line and shape and form. And again, some really interesting ideas were being produced. However, I did decide to step away from COVID-19 data for a short period of time and look at a subject that was very important to me, which is mental health data. I went to the NHS website and looked at mental health detentions per 100,000 people by ethnic group. And mental health detentions are essentially people that are being sectioned. I was really quite astounded to see the disparity in the figures. The black ethnic groups are far more likely to be sectioned than the white ethnic groups, and actually they are quite a lot further ahead in terms of having mental health issues than any of the other groups. And I just found this shocking, and it made me ask why this was. Why was it this ethnic group that was really being affected by these mental health issues? And again, this is another example of how data promotes further research, and it was really interesting to do the reading on why this disparity was, or the varying different theories as to why this disparity exists. And if I undertake a PhD, this is something that I would definitely like to look into further, these varying different data sets and why these disparities occur and the stories that are behind and the facts that are behind these numbers. So using the data, I then looked at the subtraction pattern cutting technique that I mentioned earlier by master cutter Julian Roberts. Subtraction pattern cutting basically cuts a shape out of the fabric, and I use the numbers to dictate how much in terms of area, how much of the fabric I cut away. So this was a different way of drafting it as opposed to the other samples you've seen where I've really sort of copied data lines. This here is the numbers doing the talking essentially, and you can see going from left to right, starting with the white ethnic group, going to Asian ethnic group, into the black ethnic group, the huge difference with the amount of fabric that was being cut away to produce these samples. And it presented me with some really challenging pattern cutting drafting problems because the data, the numbers were just so different. The outcome leads to these subtraction pattern cutting dresses, and you can see the different forms and the different lengths of the dresses is a direct representation of the fabric that has been subtracted. It was almost like a visual metaphor, because for people that are sectioned, they are subtracted from society for a period of time, and the subtraction of the fabric is almost subtracting those people out of that piece, that fabric that I'm using, that I'm working with. One of the things that I didn't really expect to experience when undertaking the pattern drafting, working with data, was actually how physically handling the numbers, creating these 3D forms, really made me empathise more with the data that I was handling and wanting to understand more about what it represented. Now, when I was drafting the death rate data, I was really careful to make it very, very accurate in my pattern drafting, because every single angle and curve and shape represented a loss of life. And this data you can see in front of you, this represents, these are individual people, these are people who are going through horrendous, very difficult times in their lives. And the sheer, like I said before, the sheer disparity between the different ethnic groups was sort of communicated through the sort of problems with drafting it. It was so vastly different from each other that it presented so many different issues. That was something that I really wasn't expecting to experience. I then went back to looking at the COVID data, and feedback from my tutor was, yep, these look great, these are good, but they look a bit like shells. They look like they should be on the beach. And this is not something that I was looking to achieve. So I then played around with a whole range of different ways of presenting my work. So I continued to look at projection and cartography and illuminating the work using light in different ways, creating shadows. I looked at using different textures and colours and patterns. I even used face mask fabric. The red and white jabra that you can see on the left-hand side here, this is COVID death rate data again, but the depth of each segment of the jabra is determined by the numerical data. So again, the numbers are informing how I draft. It's not directly copying the lines, it's informing the actual area and the shape of the actual the sample that I'm creating. I really liked the use of colour and light here, and I felt that it created some interesting shapes. I just felt that this could potentially be sort of representational of the NHS rainbow or something like that. I blended the colours together, really loved the different morphing of the shapes and the shadows that were created on the wall there, but they still look like shells. I suspended them from the ceiling using different lights, different colours, different configurations, but again, they still looked like shells. So I decided to get all my individual jabras and cluster them together. Now these jabras I'm using here are actually samples, and not all of them are representational of data. Some of them are just samples that I've been experimenting with to sort of create different shapes. But when I clustered all them together, it gave me the idea of a data cluster, a data glut, really sort of almost pregnant looking with data. And I really felt that this was a far more interesting shape and had real potential to go somewhere. And I really loved how it looked when I added colour. I love the fact it looked quite garish. It definitely, to me, looks quite mesmerising and quite engaging. And again, promoting that sense of conversation, promoting those questions. And I then got all the different jabras that I'd created and basically put them together in various different configurations and just let them fall as they wanted to fall and let the sculpture almost dictate itself. And I really love these two. I think that they look really quite beautiful, and you know, who in some ways is quite disarming that something that can look quite beautiful is representational of something so horrific as the pandemic that we've all been living through for the past few years. Like I said, this is still very much work in progress, and my current idea is to actually suspend the data clusters from the ceiling and actually to have them attached to a motor that very, very slowly rotates the work round. I'm not too sure if I'm going to have them illuminated or not, or a combination of both. But during my research, I've spoken to lots of different people, and I've realised that while we've all got a lot of commonality in our COVID-19 experience, there's also a lot of very nuanced individual experiences. And I really want to capture these stories, these experiences through audio recordings. And I think it's quite important that we document this while we're still living it. And we don't just look at necessarily what's in the media, but we look at everybody's sort of personal take on how the pandemic has affected them, either positively or negatively. For me, since 2019, we've sadly lost 3 family members to the pandemic. My son and I have both had COVID-19, whereas my partner and my daughter haven't. And we've had to definitely adjust our daily lives. But we're very lucky. You know, we've got lots of support around us. We've got, you know, a safe home and jobs and all that kind of stuff. And it's just really made us realise how fortunate we are. And I really would like to ensure that the work that I produce really does make people think about their own individual stories and to reflect and consider, you know, how this has affected them. That concludes my presentation, and thank you very much for listening. If you want to follow me on the final year of my master's degree, you are very, very welcome to follow me on Instagram. In the meantime, I'm really happy to answer any questions you may have, and thank you very much again for listening.